So it's lovely to be here with you today, Jared. How are you doing?
Likewise. Good, good. I've been meditating a lot, so things are quite nebulous at this moment, but I enjoy the nebulosity, so yeah, things have been going good.
Oh, wonderful. When you say you've been meditating a lot, what does that mean?
um, Mostly just kind of like silent sitting. Specifically, it's called Shine, which comes from kind of the Eroter Vajrayana lineage
Hmm.
that I've been dipping my toes into and feeling quite unsophisticated, but yeah, it's an interesting practice in the sense that it's very counterintuitive. But yeah, mostly it's just kind of about tuning into spacious awareness, and yeah, I think that's why I've had this kind of general sense of just being very off in the ether.
It sounds wonderful. My practice, as you know, is more Zen.
Mhm.
And so before this conversation, I was sitting with a koan, which is what? The koan is what?
I
Kind
like
of
that.
as in what is the fundamental nature of reality, essentially. And
Mm,
I don't know what your experiences are like, but mine also kind of brings about a kind of sinking into expansiveness.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I think from the some of the Zen um, teachings and techniques that I've been exposed to, while very little and only from a third person's perspective, it tends to resonate a lot with some of this spacious experience that I've been doing, just because it's like just the comfort of being
Mm.
okay with the unknown, which has a surprising amount of there's a surprising amount of unknown in our experience,
Yes,
and like getting comfortable with that. Yeah, it really does create an expansive sense. That's for sure.
to be sure. And I take it you're meditating more now because of the compelled home retreats that we're all on now. Is that right?
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe
Don't know.
I'm sure it's. I mean, it's very it's a conducive environment. But I actually kind of went through a shift about somewhere around about a year ago,
Hmm.
where I started to notice a lot of or some subtle striving in my practice, a lot of kind of goal orientedness, and so dialed back a lot and kind of had very little structure in my practice, even though I was still sitting most days. And but yeah, kind of got away from like have to sit 2 hours every day, no matter what, and so kind of put the drill sergeant away,
Hmm.
and just recently started to be a little bit more comfortable with introducing more time,
Hmm.
knowing that it's not coming from as much of the striving element of my psychology.
Yeah. That's what I learned from Advaita Vedanta. It shifts more toward this wonderment. It's beautiful to contemplate. It's beautiful to meditate, and the what I call the fuel source. Fuel source is the desire or longing for truth. Whereas sometimes in Buddhism, there's too much effort, you might say, or emphasis placed on effort and effortfulness,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
that can really ramp up the American Protestant ethos, which is very excited by whatever it can effort on behalf of, or for the sake of, or toward.
Yep.
I
Yep.
actually have a friend who was telling me about a certain experiment, we'll call it. And the experiment was given to him um, by a teacher, and the teacher said, just go to Starbucks and sit in Starbucks for however long you sit there. Don't do anything. Don't order anything, and you're welcome to leave whenever the desire, or the aversion, or whatever it finally subsides. That's
Mm.
it. That's the meditation, or that's not even a meditation if you think of it as a kind of practice. That's just give it a go.
The desire to leave, is that what it was?
Well, yeah,
Yeah,
what
yeah.
happens, but you sit down at a place like that, and you're fine for a few minutes, I imagine, but you're
Yeah.
not doing anything. You're maybe overcome by a acedia or by some restlessness of spirit.
Hmm.
And then that subsides, and you think, well, okay, well, I'll make it into a meditation. What happens if you stop making it into a meditation? Finally, all of that subsides. I guess you can finally, I haven't done it, but you
Yeah.
can finally leave whenever it's the case that all the pushing and pulling, all the attractions and aversions have finally subsided.
Yeah. Yeah. It evokes a lot of, the relational element for me is there seems to be a shift um, in some of my sits where I can feel that when I'm sitting down, there's, go through my checklist of grounding and everything like that. And then
Yes.
maybe think about the technique that I'm doing, or hopefully not think about it, but usually it takes a little bit before I can kind of settle in. And there is that distinctive shift of,
Mm.
all right, nowhere to go.
Yeah, exactly. Well, we began by talking about meditation because you and I are both, I think, very deeply engaged with it, but it might help to know how you got around to meditating in the first place.
Mm. Yeah, I guess quite in quite a speaking of the kind of the American ethos. Originally, it was very much a self-improvement project.
Okay.
I was into the kind of Tim Ferriss, create the most optimal human efficiency at all costs type thing. And so just started sitting, just doing basic mindfulness, 10 minutes a day or something like that. And after a few weeks, kind of noticed that, I was a little less reactive. I could be focused on my work a little bit more. So I enjoyed it. And then for probably did that for about 3 years, or I was sitting daily, but for a shorter period of time, maybe got to like 15 or 20 minutes. And then, and just saw the kind of menial benefits, but then got fascinated with this no self thing that Sam Harris had been talking about.
Oh, wow.
And was like, oh, I must attain this. I must go grab this no self thing if I'm going to be.
Why did you get so fascinated by no self at that point?
Yeah. I mean, most likely it was just because, well, it's like, well, if I've gotten some improvements in my concentration now, wait till I have this no self experience.
Oh, yeah. Wait till I'm not there to enjoy it.
Not really knowing what that meant, I suppose.
Okay.
But it was intriguing. Maybe it was partially informed. I had gotten into a lot of flow states when I was younger because I played some video games semi-professionally. So, definitely did my 10,000 hours plus of a number of different games.
We need to cite Malcolm Gladwell to make this an excellent YouTube video.
Exactly. Yeah. We got Ferris.
The gang's all here.
Ferris.
The reason I asked you that question,
yeah.
and I want to hear more about how you got around to where you are today, is that there is that switch that occurs for some people. They go from what I call secular meditation, and I recently wrote an article called Secular Monks or Secular Monasticism, of the kind that you're just describing, self-optimization projects. But meditation, if you stick with it, is very seductive. At some point, you might find that the very reasons you got into it are precisely not the ones that will carry you further. And you start to realize that this has actually become much more mysterious.
Yeah.
And as you said, nebulous than you could have possibly imagined. And that's the interesting part, where things start to shift toward the transcendent or spiritual or religious.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 100%. And I guess to go back where I was at, I realized quickly that reading a bunch of books about no self was not really doing much for me, and still was very confusing. So started looking for some retreats, and attended a couple weekend retreats. One of them with Michael Taft, who had put together a project called Deconstructing Yourself, or a retreat called Deconstructing Yourself. That was a very kind of dry Vipassana way of pulling apart the aspects that that predominantly provide the sense of self. And then after getting back from that retreat, kind of had this spontaneous experience, not while sitting, just kind of in my office, looking around. I caught my reflection in the mirror, and all of a sudden, kind of a lot of the things that I had been focusing on, I went from like being identified with them, my own thoughts and what I was, movements and decisions, to kind of seeing them as a process, and started, any kind of sense of agency just kind of dissolved after a few seconds, and laughed hysterically for a few minutes at the absurdity of of this thing, and then that lasted a couple weeks.
The absurdity of the experience, or the absurdity of the realization, or the absurdity of the sense of self, or
all of the above, I
okay,
guess.
okay.
Yeah. I remember I had an urge to check my phone, and I could like see the habitual pattern. Like I picked it up and I was like I could just see the the strings behind the mannequin type thing.
Yes.
And so it was just kind of hilarious, but kind of released into this very, I say disembodied to a certain degree, but it's more like, it was kind of like life had become a movie. I was just kind of watching things unfold. And there's no kind of boundary, because I could see so many of my own actions being a result of something that happened outside of me. The boundary didn't really exist for quite a while. And it went that way for a couple of weeks, and had crazy, time got dilated. It seemed like months that had gone by, and any kind of emotional attachment was just not possible anymore. If anything did come up, that was some sort of residue. It was hilarious. It was funny to think that I was a kind of victim to this previous habitual patterns, and then after a few weeks, it started. Then the self started recongealing, even though it was significantly different coming out of that. But that sparked the like, oh, okay, there is something real to this.
Yes.
And I should look into it, and then kind of went away from more of the secular stuff and found myself being a little bit more into the more numinous, religious, spiritual language, just because it was that much more accessible and relatable to this experience that I had. That's when it shift it happened, and it was no longer predominantly about self improvement, but more of an interest with the whatever had happened to me, and just how mysterious, to your point.
What a gift that is too. And I mean, what a proof in the pudding moment.
It was definitely, it was kind of, I know a lot of people talk about having major shifts, but it was definitely like part one, part two. That was a part two of life began.
Sure.
It's kind of spent my time since then bouncing around from different schools and teachings and teachers and systems and models and maps and paths. Now I've kind of found myself predominantly interested in Vajrayana, specifically because the Dzogchen is the element that's kind of a little bit Advaita Vedanta, in the sense that like there's nowhere to go. Everything's already, you're already there, kind of starting with where you are, but still contextualizing it in some of the previous Buddhist language that was very much about getting somewhere, or doing the improvement needed to become enlightened, or whatever it is. That's kind of a broad picture, I guess, of how I got here. It's continually kind of unfolding in new, mysterious ways, and also very much recontextualize my kind of intellectual pursuits. I noticed a lot of my attachments to theories and ideas and concepts that I had thought that had really worked out, and has kind of allowed me to be a lot more kind of open and open to different ways of seeing the world and things like that too. And so yeah, I host a podcast with a buddy of mine called Both And, where we kind of try and see multiple perspectives on certain topics and explore them, and try not to be so captured by any one right way, but more just a kind of kind of the in-between space of the tribes, I suppose.
What do you mean to say that you don't have the same kind of relationship with intellectual considerations that you once had? What are you referring to there?
Yeah. I mean, I at a time I was a very kind of a card-carrying libertarian. The whole ideology, very much captured right way of the world. This is the way the world works. Everybody else kind of had naive perspectives and political ideas, or free will was one. I had very, very much become a determinist for quite a while. So yeah, just kind of a lot of like intellectual certainty in certain concepts, ideologies that I had thought I had really worked out. But then, when you, I guess when that self, when there's nobody there to own the ideology anymore, it creates some distance in which you can kind of see it from a bit of a bird's eye view, which then kind of affords you to look at competing perspectives charitably as well, because nobody's owning them in your experience, I guess.
Quite apart from the proposal that it's a sense of self that's attached to these theories, why else do you think that you were so gripped by, say, libertarianism or whatever was the case?
I mean, I'm sure it's a myriad of my own personal history. My family was kind of a predominantly conservative orientation. Some of them more in the more traditional conservative, and some of them more in the libertarian. So just kind of environmental accidents, and just also kind of being priding myself on rationality, and libertarianism is a lot about hey, let's move past our emotions and look at things with a rational logical mind, and yeah, so for whatever reason, that my personality just really enjoyed these different themes and stories and ideas, and was quickly able to kind of glom onto them. And but then unfortunately it kind of puts you in the position where you can't really listen to competing perspectives without just viewing it all through that lens, right? Where it's like, oh, how does this disagree with me, or how does this agree with me? And that's the only thing that can really, or the predominant way of exploring different ideologies, is to see why it's wrong or why it's right because of your previous ideological
it's
concepts.
what's sad is that it presupposes a certain modest level of animosity.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah,
that is to say, the other person is probably wrong. So let's start there.
Oh yeah. Well, and that, from a personality perspective, that was me 101 growing up. Even before any kind of intellectual pursuits, I was always had a abundance of self-confidence for whatever reasons.
Sure, I remember that too. Self-confidence is a nice word to describe arrogance.
Yeah, maybe that's what arrogance is, an abundance of self-confidence.
Yeah, overabundance.
Yes. So yeah, it's yeah, and I mean the funny thing too is that after this kind of dissolution, you also start to realize like the personality really likes to kind of recohere. Like I might have broken it apart, but it's very resilient in the sense that it then is like, okay, well now let's make a new, bigger self to, and this is, I think, I was like,
what do you mean? A bigger self that's tolerant, say?
Yeah.
Is that what you mean? It can, when you say a bigger one, it can reiterate itself in a more sophisticated format.
Yeah. It's like making it a little bit more foolproof. It's almost like
Kevlar approved.
Yeah. It's like the strange thing, and this also kind of speaks to, I think, some of the limitations of this Vipassana approach of kind of observing the self or your experience. there's an observer, right? So like then this, so suddenly the personality starts to kind of slowly transfer over to this observer that's outside of the previous instantiation. And it's broader, it's bigger because, and more, because it contains the previous one. But it still has this tendency to recollate, or to kind of recohere in a bigger way. And the intellectual mind too is very insidious in the sense that it can do some really interesting rationalization and gymnastics to kind of button up stories and make things kind of self-coherent. So yeah, that has been like phases of that, of kind of like seeing these reinstantiations, noticing them and kind of letting them dissolve again. And that's what kind of led me to this, the more radical stance, where it's just like, you just can't really trust anything fully that's being offered up by the mind and conceptuality. Even though it's still valuable. I mean, I still love talking about philosophy and politics and science and all of these kind of projects. They're still interesting to me, and I see them as super valuable. But yeah, they've become very much or much more contextualized as maps and not the territory, whereas the territory has become something that's quite mysterious, and I'm kind of okay with that.
Yeah. With regard to your point about how through that Boston approach you're referring to, one that I'm not quite as familiar with, you begin to stand as the observer of sorts. It's more transparent and luminous and such, and that's the bigger self you're referring to. I recently went to a retreat, and I'll share this with you because it's a funny story. And so I'm going to a retreat with Francis Lucille, who's a contemporary Advaita Vedanta teacher. And he has a very French, he has an accent like this, and he speaks actually like this. And I asked him a question. This is during satsang, which involves students asking a question of the teacher. And so I muster up the courage. He's a very smart guy, very smart, and it's a very strange setting. And so I basically asked him, how does the witness finally drop off? Basically, it's sort of the great enlightenment or some such, or however you want to call it, or self-realization. And so I'm asking, had a kind of plotted question. I said, how does it drop off? He said, well, you just stop it. you just stop it. You just stop taking your stand as a witness. It's like, oh. It was like a very Zen. I was like, okay, we're back in Zen. Yeah. And he was actually referring to a Newhart skit, which I'll include in the show notes. A very short skit in which this psychologist named, played by Bob Newhart some years ago on Comedy Central, is there, and this young woman who's young, doe-eyed, somewhat trepidatious woman comes in, and it's her first session with him, and he says, well, come and sit down, and she doesn't, and he says, well, this is how it works here. It's just a 15-minute session, 15 minutes, and if it's less than 15 minutes, then I think he said $5. I could be wrong about this, but if it's more than 15 minutes, it's just $5. Okay, and we don't accept checks, just cash. He's like, is that okay with you? She's like, yeah, that's good. $5, it's cool. It's cool. And he says, okay, so what's your issue? Very psychological. And so she says, okay, well. And she tells him this very, very psychological story about, I don't know, it's like paranoia or something like this. And viewers should just go and watch it. It's this very confabulated story about this and that, my mother and this and that. You feel as though it's just this complete wonderful rendering of a terrible psychoanalytic drama. And he says, okay. So I got it. So here's what you do. You ready? She's like, yeah, I'm ready. Do I need to write it down? No, I think you remember it. You can remember this. He says, okay, just stop it. Okay, you just stop it. And then the skit keeps going on. She mentions something else. She's bewildered. So, of course, what does that to say? But one can, in Advaita language, that means one stops taking one's stand as a witness, because the witness was just a tool utilized in order to deconstruct certain aspects of body, identifications of body and mind, or body and finite mind.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also one of those answers that's completely disappointing, right? Because it's precisely what you're asking. That is, how does it happen? And he's saying it happens, or just, not even just do it, but
Yep. Yeah, it's yeah, and the tough thing is we don't know when it's going to happen, and the more we want it to happen, the less likely it probably will.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think this speaks a lot to the value of, I love the word mystery, in the sense it's kind of it's a surrender into mystery. So it's saying, I guess I will never know what I can't conceptualize it. It's unconceivable.
Mm-hmm.
And ironically, it's kind of like I kind of sum up my pet description of why doing spiritual practice is important, or what it's actually doing. If somebody asks me, I say it's basically just finding ways to experience the totality of our experience, to be with whatever is happening. And unfortunately, a large part of what is happening is unknown, but there's something to this unknownness, and our rejection of it, our inability to be okay with the unknown is what kind of has us kind of grasping for these, constantly coming up with new stories and new patterns and ideas of what it is.
What's striking is that your reply to someone, your interlocutor, is really quite fascinating, because it's an unexciting answer. That is to say, be with whatever it is the case, whatever is arising. Just be with whatever is arising. Now, it's to those in the know, it's quite something what you're saying.
That's a big deal.
It's a big deal. Yeah. But it's interesting, because I'm imagining your interlocutor perhaps not knowing too much about spiritual practice, and you say, well, it's being with the totality of experience as it's arising right here and right now. The person might say, okay, pass. Or that's okay. But it's a little bit like you're giving an esoteric/exoteric answer. The exoteric answer is be with whatever is arising. At the same time, it's an esoteric answer. If you start to let yourself in on the open secret, you realize that that's, as you said, it's a big deal.
Yeah. And I think, the weird thing here is, or kind of the counterintuitive thing of the reason it doesn't sound very interesting, I think, is because it's until we kind of figure out what it's like to be okay with something in our experience that we weren't okay with previously, we're kind of unaware how much we were resisting it, and how much energy was being employed to deny our some aspect of our experience. And it's quite freeing, and it's almost like another metaphor I sometimes like is talking about how life is a very high bandwidth experience. There's a lot of stuff going on. It's very vast, and if we constrict ourselves to only the things that we think we want, or we want to avoid, or things whatever it is, all of a sudden we get down to this like very low resolution version of reality, and we're constantly exerting effort, unbeknownst to us, to constrict it. So it's kind of this
while constricting ourselves.
Exactly. Yeah. And so but it's really hard to. It's definitely, I like the Matrix metaphor. You can't be seen what the Matrix is. You have to, or you can't be told. You have to see it for yourself. It's kind of one of those things. Except for, instead of seeing, I think I would say you have to experience it for yourself.
To be sure.
Because seeing is just a small aspect of experience.
I was having a conversation yesterday with a man who was talking to me about the fact that he thinks that most people's opinions are wrong. and he has a view of philosophizing that to me is very much of the agon sort. Philosophy is debate. And this is, I think I said, you've been listening to too much Sam Harris. That's not really the essence of philosophy by my lights. And I was just giving a different account. It's a little bit like when you have a conversation with someone, particularly if it's about, let's say, spiritual practice, and particularly if it's someone who starts to become a little bit curious but doesn't really know much. All you're doing is providing little clues. You sprinkle them about. I mean, that's what teachers are doing, but teachers are more direct in this way. They're providing pointers.
Yeah.
What's amazing about that clue is that, or that pointer, or that little breadcrumb, or that, as Hafiz calls it, a key for the prisoners. Whatever metaphor you want to use. What's pretty amazing about it is that some people will pick one of those up, and not really know quite what they picked up exactly. And later on, it will stay with them. I actually use the metaphor often of a seedling being planted, just a little seedling planted during a conversation.
Yeah. And
sometime later, a month, 2 months, a year, 2 years, unbeknownst to that person, as you nicely put it before, things have already been sprouting. They're just coming up, and then the person starts to see something, or feel something, or experience something that hadn't been seen or felt or experienced before. So that's kind of brings us back in a way to what was happening as you began with a self-improvement project, and then you realize that the self meant to be improved had the rug pulled out from under him, and that's the cosmic joke. Yeah. That's why there really should be a lot more danger signs put on the fronts of zendos. You really don't know what's going to happen if you come in here.
Yeah. Well, and this is even in that experience. You can, if you look around a bit, you can hear a lot of people talking about these really difficult parts of self insight, the deconstructing of self, in the sense like, I know, dark night of the soul is something that's brought up a lot. And it's these really trying periods where, this letting go of the self is a really tough thing to do. Because in some ways it's a death. It's a letting go of what we kind of saw as primary in our experience, to move into something else. And not until we let go of that do we get to see what comes afterwards. And I remember even, so as this experience of me catching my reflection and starting to become aware of the mechanics of the self, there was a moment, at first it was kind of elating. I was like, oh, this is what they were talking about. And it was exciting. And then there was a few thoughts that came up of, well, whose passions are the, I had all these ideas, like, this is what I'm passionate about. This is what I'm here for. This, I had a lot of ideas of what I was doing. Yeah. And I was like, oh, what happens to those? And there was, this moment of dread or terror, where I realized that there was a choice of either just seeing these thoughts that come up as something that was also conditioned, and kind of wrapped up in this thing that I was starting to see the falseness in. Or I also saw the option of being like, no, I will not let go of them. Dear God, hold on. Yeah. And I very
this is the good stuff.
Yeah. This is good stuff. I don't want. I thought this was all good. Yeah, and but for whatever reason, I like I don't have a Christian background. I was actually quite secular, but I love the word grace, in the sense that for whatever reason, there's a grace that allowed me to just kind of watch those thoughts come and go and give into what was unfolding. But yeah, it could have gone a very different way. It could have been years of depression, or intense anxiety, or any number of different things. And yeah, for whatever reason, my personality was just in a place where I was given the opportunity to let into that experience. Which kind of speaks, I guess, to this phrase baggage, right? Our personality baggage.
I was just thinking about that right now.
Yeah.
Because this brings us back to the conversation we had before this conversation. What is baggage? I have a feeling you're feeding this one to me. You're feeding me this question, so I'll ask it. I'll go for the bait.
I was primed for baggage conversation, and we've been dancing around it. But I think it's good in the sense that we've been pointing at it from multiple directions, I think.
Right.
And I think it's a bit complicated, but like in the most colloquial sense, I think baggage is kind of the aspects of our experience that we avoid because they're uncomfortable. And I think they're also, if we're talking about this in psychological terms, we're talking about the things about ourselves that we don't want to see or we don't want to be with.
Mm-hmm.
And there's, I don't know, maybe I'll just say, does that make sense as a wrapping it into the spiritual project of how baggage fits into this aspect? Because there's some other areas too, being with the totality of our experience requires us to accept the uncomfortable parts, but it also means to be able to let the things that we enjoy, like my passions, go away if they must, because things.
Is that also baggage? Is that what you're including as well, or not?
Yeah,
usually have a tendency to refer to it as the negative stuff.
I think in the sake of kind of like a cohesive definition, I wouldn't say that like attachment to the good stuff is baggage itself, but it can create baggage as a kind of second order effect of the attachment.
Sure.
Right? If we're unwilling to let go of something, then it creates a space that's we're unwilling to investigate, which would be the fact that maybe these things aren't ours, aren't permanent, or something like that.
No doubt you love your wife, but if you really grip hard on loving your wife, then the second order effects would be I'm very afraid of her death, and I can't possibly live without her, and so forth.
Exactly. And taken to an extreme, I think if we're so craving of the connection we have with somebody, maybe it's our wife, it could be impossible for us to let them be in circumstances where they aren't with us, or they're given the opportunity to be with other people and maybe get something from that experience. So it's like, then it kind of creates this neurotic, possessive quality, which then ultimately manifests or many times would manifest in losing them, right? So it's kind of, it's this cruel trick in the sense that the holding on to the thing can sometimes be the very thing that leads to us losing it and making it that much more traumatic. That, I guess, so attachment to the things that we enjoy, maybe leading to second order baggage. And then there's like a third category. I don't know if this one's worth bringing up. Maybe I'll just throw it out there. But if this is just like points to, in my opinion, why meditation is usually part of spiritual paths, and that's becoming acquainted with the things that we were that were happening in our experience that we were unaware of, and that we, for whatever reason, sometimes it's because it's just not that interesting. If we have all of this baggage and attachments that we are really in this war to keep and keep away and hold on to, we kind of neglect a bunch of other stuff that seems trivial or non-interesting. And this is the more subtle aspects of our experience, and which ironically is I think where some of these, even where spirit comes from, is because it's kind of these ephemeral, can't touch, can't feel, but they're a part of your experience. And so getting in touch with those takes time of us looking for them, or allowing them to come up because we're no longer in a war with ourselves, I suppose.
So you're telling us that there are three basic categories. The first is avoidance of presumably bad things. The second is attachment to the good things, which can bring about further baggage. And the third is the unawareness of subtle aspects of experience.
Yeah. And a lot of times too, we find that there's a lot of baggage that we can find in the subtle stuff too. So it's like, we don't know, this would be, getting into the root system of some of our baggage. Like it wasn't previously visible, but we realized like, oh, I can't just pluck the top of the weed, like it's still there. I gotta do some digging to really uproot and understand where this is coming from. So that's why it's important, I think, in the baggage frame, because a lot of our baggage is just it's unaware. We're unaware of it. We only see it once it's sprouted, but it is very deep in the soil of our experience, I suppose.
Yeah, to be sure. So before we come to look at these things more fully, and probably the first category first, why do you think it's important to look at baggage?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's kind of coming back to this, the project of experiencing life fully, all aspects of life fully. If we don't, we're kind of limiting our world. We've created kind of boundaries which we're unwilling to venture into, which I guess in a very, in a spiritual sense, you're saying like, okay, well, you're denying life in some way. You can be very poetic about this, but in a very practical sense, a lot of times when I talk to rational folks, or more scientific-minded people, I think that it's important to have this broader point of view, or wider range of experience, because it informs how we act as well. In the sense that, the more information we have to make decisions or navigate, the better the outcome. If we're unaware of a large portion of what is happening, our ability to make decisions on a very small portion of it, it's kind of limiting our capacity in some way. Yeah,
it's interesting that's the I guess you're imagining that we're speaking with a certain rationalist, and you're answering the question, why is it that's important for you, rationalist or skeptic or secular humanist, to look at baggage? It's interesting it seems as though that's the first way you responded. I would have thought a very low-hanging fruit was because it hurts. And you don't know that it hurts. I call it kickback. If you don't look at your baggage, unfortunately, from a Socratic point of view, it kicks back, it hurts.
Yeah, for sure.
I just wanted a low-hanging fruit answer first.
Yeah. Well, and this is kind of like Buddhism 101, right? Like life is suffering. How do we remove the suffering component? And probably the reason it wasn't first to mind is just because of the frustration that I have in some of if I have that suffering frame of like, hey, you're actually like you're suffering all the time. And you need to remove yourself from the suffering. A very common response is, no, I'm not suffering. I would know, and it's hard to know. That's the insidious part of this, of our baggage, is a lot of times it's hiding, its negative impacts are hiding. So it's hard to, well, I guess it kind of depends on the person too. Some people start getting into the spirituality for the opposite reason of self-improvement, of like becoming the best they can be, but it's more of like being able to cope, right? And this would directly respond to, life's hard. I want it to be easier, so I have to deal with the things that are hard. I
see what you mean. It's a little bit easier for me because I'm having a philosophical conversation with someone, and that person has already entered into a space where there's an understanding about the way that the questioning will unfold. So I don't get just one opportunity to say, let's discover this baggage. When we discover it, we see it, the person feels it, it becomes clear, very experientially so. But the trouble with the way I cast the question before which was, why is it important to look at baggage, is that we're imagining an interlocutor who comes off the street. You knock into that person, you get one shot to say, well, why is this important? And you're assuming, of course, perhaps that this is someone who doesn't presume that's important. It may not admit that there is such a thing. Just as this person may not admit that there are realities that are not visible, that are not perceptible, or even conceptualizable. That's I'm not talking about other worlds. I'm talking about our actual experience it's not amenable to the sense organs or to mental patterns. So that's also a hard one to put forward and make plain. In other words, anytime there's something that, as you said, is apparently invisible in that person's experience, the question, why is it important to look at what what the other person presumes does not exist, is a hard nut to crack.
Yeah. There's no problem to be solved because
Yeah.
they don't, yeah, whatever you're talking about doesn't apply here, right? Type thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I guess, yeah, I do have this kind of like, it's always funny to see like what frame I end up adopting on these conversations that are recorded, because I guess in this situation, I'm thinking, all right, the people that will be tuning into you are, very intelligent, well developed people who are bettering themselves intellectually and maybe ethically on a regular basis, and so yeah, why would this person, why would they be interested in in something like this, if they're already improving and kind of striving to be better from the get-go. Yeah, for some reason there's always an ephemeral idea of who's listening is always present.
Let's just turn to an example of baggage, because maybe that will help us become clear. And maybe if we can walk through the example, particularly in the case of avoiding the so-called bad thing, maybe it'll become clear why it'll be important to actually look at baggage. So can you think of an example that's especially vivid, clear?
Yeah, for some reason, so usually my go-to is like the most gruesome stuff, so like fear of death or something like that. But for some reason, especially because we're talking the subtleness of these things, it comes to mind that there was a moment shortly, as I started to discover personal baggage of my own and realizing how kind of mundane and simple it could be. I was in the shower and I was thinking about my wedding day for whatever reason, and whenever that wedding day comes up, there's this image of the photo that was taken right after we had gotten done taking our vows, and it's this very cute photo, a professional photographer, and everybody liked it a lot. But the first thing that always would come to my mind was that, I had some acne on that day, and I could still see it on that photo. And so it's like, it was this cruel reality that I realized because I was aware of what was happening as I was remembering this experience, and this image was popping in my head, was that I always had a negative connotation anytime that that picture came up, because I was like, oh, if I just wish I wouldn't have been breaking out, my skin was really bad that day. And it just tainted the whole, this very profound, important part of my life.
It tainted that whole day, or it tainted just the picture?
It just tainted I guess it kind of stopped me from being able to move into that whole day, because the whole day was actually fun. But all of a sudden I'm realizing that just this simple image was pulling me off in a different direction. In normal circumstances, I'd be like, oh, well, is my skincare regime doing well today? Like, am I doing better? All of a sudden I'm no longer able to enjoy this experience because of this very subtle.
You're flickering in and out. Right between the, acne, how did I get this? What did I do wrong? What do I need to do to change my regime? And then, okay, this is wonderful. It's the flickering.
Yeah.
Feels painful.
And often, it just, that little thing could flicker me off, and I'm no longer able to enjoy this memory of what my wedding day was like, because I'm thinking about my skincare regime. But the interesting thing is, this kind of comes to the importance of getting a lot of clarity of the subtle aspects, is like, because I could actually see this unfolding, like, oh, okay, here was my wedding day. Now this image comes up, and I'm aware of it as it's coming up. And then my initial reaction is to have there's a negative connotation with it. Seeing that, actually unfold live, which normally would just be something that was kind of preconscious, and I was unaware that I'm off on the stream. Seeing it clearly that one time, that erased it. I was like, that's absurd. Like, why would that ever happen? And so now that no longer comes up. So this was this awareness of the baggage, seeing it for what it was, actually erased it. So, and there was this weird thing too that.
So wait, if I have you called up right now, you call up your wedding day and you call up that picture. Do you have any of those
Yeah, I mean, I think there, well, ironically, there is a bit of, with that picture exactly, it now has been, there's a remembering of this profound cleaning up experience,
Yes, yes, right.
profound yet unimaginably mundane and simple and stupid kind of, and so it's kind of, now it kind of evokes a little bit of, you know, laughter at the absurdity, or yeah, it's just, so it's been kind of, it's been rewritten in a certain way, in a way that is no longer something that I resist, and maybe something that actually, it was a learning, because that was one of the first times that I kind of got this, I started to understand this subtle taste of cleaning up our personal baggage, even in the most mundane ways.
Yeah. With what effect? So you clean up this piece of baggage having to do with the way you remember your wedding day, and probably also the way you think of your physical appearance more generally. You start cleaning this up. What is the effect or implication?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess the core implication is just that I can no longer boot up the negative reaction to that image. Like it just doesn't have, it doesn't have any legs anymore. But if we're talking about the positive connotation that's now been rewritten, of finally realizing, because when I say the taste of cleaning up, it's kind of like this deep knowing that, like, because when I saw it, and I kind of laughed at it, the absurdity, I immediately knew somehow deep in my bones that it would never be something that I would, it didn't have the same negative residue that it did before. It had been kind of wiped clean, or recontextualized. And God knows how many times before that I had thought about this image and had this negative connotation of, oh my God, my bad acne, I wish I wouldn't have had, and really, like, being upset with something that happened, that had happened. It's like, this happened. There's literally nothing I could do.
Yes.
So yeah, it was just the most micro insight, I suppose.
It's a beautiful example. So if we can kind of generalize a little bit, if we imagine cleaning up at least the first category referring to avoiding the bad things, then we're imagining, we don't even have to imagine, we can experience it, but for now we'll imagine it. We're imagining that the sorts of things that used to be very constrictive, very compressing, very tightening, very, very resistant, are starting to lose their grip. And then there's spaciousness, as some would describe it, or transparency. Recently, I've been referring to it as fluidity. I think that Tao Te Ching is just very nice, has very nice descriptions of how the Taoist sage is just flexible and lithe and nimble. And it's that flexibility I'm trying to make representation of with my hands, right? It's that fluid way of being that suggests that nothing can I can't get hit by an arrow, as it were, because the arrow passes through. Before, it had a surface and it had substance to lodge itself into. So it's a little bit like, I'm sure this is true for you, but when you listen to someone and you're just listening, there's nothing to, the listening doesn't stop somewhere. Nothing gets caught. There's no junk in the machine. These are bad metaphors, but there's just, as Zen would say, just listening. So the experiences are just of the just. I'm just listening. I'm just talking right now. It's not, I'm talking right now, and what is Jared going to think about what I'm about to say? Is that the way I wish to express how I wish to express what I'm going to express? That's the experience of transparent, fluid, luminous, knowing, present being. And I also tend to say that it's a fundamental glimpse or taste of our true nature. This is our destiny, if you will. This is how life is, life optimally is, or
Yeah.
it's a hint of what life is optimally about.
Yeah. It's another metaphor that I like sometimes is kind of thinking about life being a roller coaster in the sense that, there's a track, like it's going to have a certain trajectory. There's certain bends that are there, whether you want them to be or not. You're on the ride.
Yeah.
And if to be completely contracted in that whole experience, because it's scary, and life is scary, right? to be just away from the experience and constantly in this small panicky way of experiencing the ride. I mean, it's just, I don't know why you'd want to do that when you could throw your hands up and smile and enjoy.
But you also
wind.
lean, this may be a little bit too Taoist for your picture, but you also lean gorgeously, beautifully into the turn.
Yes.
You don't pull away from the turn.
Yes. Yeah.
So unbeknownst to ourselves, we've been pulling away from not every turn, but many, many turns over and over again in different ways.
Yeah. Well, and this is, the other kind of this fluidity too, right? Is like, it's the difference between, life will still, the roller coaster ride is still going to catch you off guard, right? There's going to be a time where, you get pulled one way and it's maybe uncomfortable for a moment. And one way is to really, resist it so much. And another way is just, kind of, whoa, that was kind of,
yeah, right. Yeah, exactly.
Go with it. Yeah. Ooh, yeah. Like, I like the fluidity is important. But if there's no space to be fluid in, it doesn't happen. Yeah. I'm very visual. I always like to, in my mind, it's like I always feel like I'm translating these kind of visual little snapshots of what these dynamics look like, as opposed to I guess the logic or something of it. So I like it a lot.
I think this gives other people a genuine. I like to use the metaphor of taste, because it's just a little taste. What is it like to not have the baggage of, for example, having a memory that continues to recur time and time again and continues to haunt or harangue me? Well, it's not just that the memory's gone, it's that there's a kind of fluid, knowing, aware, awake, cheerful presence. As you said, most of your stories are really nice because they're accompanied by a sense of humor, right? There is a lightness of being. Things are they're not always funny, but they're cheerful. Sometimes they're very funny. Sometimes it's just very cheerful, right? I once had a friend who used to talk about resilience. This is why I don't talk about resilience. He was giving talks and he said, this is some years ago, he said, I define resilience as the capacity to take a punch. And I don't want to be that person. I don't need to be, if we define the resilience in that way, I don't wish to be resilient. I wish to be anti-fragile or fluid or something like that. That's what you don't need to take the punch, because the punch has nothing to hit.
Yeah.
There has to be something there to be struck, right? So there has to already be some form of resistance to what could come to pass in order to take the punch. This is why I'm not a Stoic. We'll get to that some other time.
It kind of reminds me of like Muay Thai fighters, that they do this thing where they kick these wood beams over and over again until their calf is just completely calloused. It's like it can't be damaged anymore. And it's a type, I guess it's a type of resilience. But when it's taken to an extreme, it creates a fragility in the sense that, it no longer has the ability to adapt or be flexible. I always like bamboo just because it's so strong yet so adaptable and and bendy.
I've been marveling at the dandelions in our front. We've gotten a lot of rain in this part of northern New Mexico this year. So the dandelions have sprouted up. Our neighbor doesn't like them because their energy, they suck a lot of water. But I'm like, oh, they're just so lovely. They remind me of my youth. And look how amazingly resilient they are. They have the little cheerful face. And then if you go to mow them with your non-electric, I have a non-electric push mower, the old fashioned kind. And they just kind of like this. And if they come out with their seeds, they're like, if you go over the seeds, like, it's just like, thank you. You just allowed me to disperse hundreds of seeds. And then the stem just like, yep, I got you, bro. You're fine. I mean, they're just an amazing example of what it's like, right? Because they're very strong relative to their size and strength and so on. And they're also, their strength is partly the result of being able to move with the wind or a lawnmower or whatever. And of course, they're also able to disperse plentiful life into the breeze. They're extraordinary. And the wind is what takes them. It feels as though it's a completely wonderful Taoist example. They don't have to do anything. The wind will carry them.
Yeah. I love it. Yeah, it's a good, so many juicy visual metaphors here.
Yeah. Let's come to the second case. So you were suggesting that another form of baggage is a kind of attachment to the good things of life. And this might lead to second order deleterious baggage effects. Can you give us an example of that? And we already went through the love example, so maybe different from love.
Yeah, I'm trying. I guess the first thing that came to mind was like to bring up these passions that I had mentioned. That there was a fear of losing as the Jared started to dissolve in front of me. I think the interesting thing that comes up here is that a lot of the attachment component seems to be centered around kind of fear of impermanence or change, or so yeah, again, coming to this ability to be adaptable. And so to take my passions for example, I, at the time, so this would be I guess a clear example. One of the things that I was passionate about at the time when this happened was that I had started a small nonprofit that was like an online crowdsourced charity club, and had really kind of built a lot of my own. Like if somebody said, "What do you do?" Like, "Oh, well, I started a nonprofit. I have this nonprofit, and we're gonna change the way philanthropy works." And I really loved that idea, and so letting go of the idea that was like what defined me was super uncomfortable. But because I was allowed to be okay with the fact that I didn't own it, it allowed it to be kind of fluid in the sense that I doubt over the next couple of years, which I've since kind of shut down this project to concentrate on other things. I doubt that I would have been able to allow it to develop and grow and adapt to whatever circumstances I had, that it presented themselves over the following years. So there were a lot of changes that I came to after this, and I was able to eventually kind of come to see that this is maybe not something that is the best use of my time, and being okay with it going by. This economic sunk cost fallacy comes into mind as well, right? Where it's like we put some time into something and we can't stand the idea that it would be going away. And so yeah, it's kind of being okay with the fact that things will change, things will go away, allows them to be kind of like flourish the most while they are alive, and adapting and growing. I don't know. That one might not be quite as as tactile as my my wedding picture, but and I guess what we're hinting at here too is that this impermanence aversion does kind of always kind of point back toward our own impermanence as well.
Yes.
Yeah.
I can flesh that a little bit. I've been speaking. This would take quite a while to talk about, so I won't say too much about it. I've been speaking about total work for the last 3 years. I define total work as the process by which human beings are transformed into capital W workers and nothing else, as more and more aspects of life come to be work or work-like. I won't make the case about how that happened or what it means, but but at least what it means is that people take their stand, to use Advaita language, as the doer, and the doer is instantiated in the form of the worker. The worker manifests himself or herself in the form of working on the world, as well as in the form of working on the self. So that's where the secular monasticism remark came in. That's the self-improvement project is the project of the worker who has internalized it or made it Foucaultianized. Okay? It's that version. The other version we hear about in Silicon Valley is the outward-facing version that involves startups and scaling and growth and so forth. But we shouldn't just say these are just two Silicon Valley versions. They're versions, I think, of many people today. When they wake up in the morning, they take their stand right as the mind comes online as the one who's doing and tasked with doings by various sorts. So I present that framing, if you will, because it allows us to see that people have very strong attachments to their identities, which is bound up with work broadly or narrowly understood. In consequence, when that is lost, as it almost unwittingly is, in virtue of the fact that organizational life, corporate life, entrepreneurial life, solopreneur life is more changeable today than it had been certainly 40 years prior, then invariably it creates suffering. So the strong attachment to being such and such. So I'm very critical of careerism. I'm very critical of most of these concepts, but certainly careerism feels to me like an ideological capture of a gainful employment system that is utterly inhumane, very fragile, and unconscionable. Really, we're seeing the effects of it right now. It was 22 million. It might be 28 million people in the United States who have recently filed for unemployment. It's shocking and horrifying and deeply saddening and very concerning.
Yeah.
But we ask ourselves, what were people attached to? To be sure, part of it was livelihood, and I think livelihood is a good thing, period. The other part is the part you're alluding to. They were attached to taking their stand as being the kind of person who is doing such and such, and who could not possibly do anything but or other than such and such.
Yeah, and there also seems to be a big future focus here too, where it's like, it's living in the future of creating these ideas of what you're creating and what it will be, as opposed to and constantly kind of implying here that we're dissatisfied with what it is in the moment, and so yeah, this is another common thing I like to say is like there's the best and worst thing that can happen to somebody is to get everything they want. It's the best because they finally arrived, and maybe there's even a moment where they're like, oh yes, of celebration, but it's the worst because then you realize that you have to keep going. It's not you haven't crossed the finish line, and if you're not satisfied with what's happening in the moment, you with the circumstances, I suppose, it's hard to know what to do, and you can double down. You can come up with a new goal. It's like, okay, well, I guess that wasn't it. Now I got to come up with the next. I guess millionaire was cool, but it must be the billionaire mark.
Yes, well, it's a beautiful epigram you provide. My joke would be the worst thing. Mine would be a little bit cheekier. It would be, well, the worst thing you can get is to get everything you want in life.
Yeah.
It's precisely what doesn't allow for what I call an existential opening to the possibility of reflecting on or questioning the questioner. And it's not going to happen so long as life continues to bear fruit for you. I mean, remember that we know the story of Gautama. He's living in this very opulent place. Everything is handed to him. And it's only when he goes outside and sees illness, old age, and death, he's, what? This is shocking. And so he begins his path to become the Buddha. I think it's actually more shocking to see what happens to people when life continues to bear fruit for them, because they're not aware, they're not awake, and I'm not using that in a Buddhist term yet, or not entirely. And I say it doesn't really create depth. You start to have this kind of depth, or you call it subtlety as well, when you start to see that life is not just offering you one little gift after another little gift and so on. Because you have to start reckoning. I know that was at the age of 29. I started reckoning. I left academia, and when my eldest sister died unexpectedly, I had to reckon. It wasn't that I thought it was great that she died. It certainly was not that at all. It was very unexpected. But there started to be this reckoning with the assumptions that hitherto had not been brought into being. So what's kind of wonderful about the second category of baggage is that when you're attached to the good things and you begin to notice the good things start to shake or shimmy, then you're given the genuine gift, not the illusory gift of being able to reckon, examine, introspect, and so on. And you begin to actually see the baggage that has been there all along, always in your right hand.
Yeah. It's I don't know. It's interesting. Yeah, it seems like it can be both the best or worst in the sense, and it kind of is both in the sense, so I actually can even remember a tough time, which resulted from, I remember I was like in my early 20s. I had my job and living in downtown, and just moved into an apartment, and had gone to IKEA and got all of the, just the pieces that I wanted. And my room was, like my house, my little studio.
It all looked very Swedish all of a sudden.
Oh yeah, I know. The aesthetic was there, everything. And I had this moment of like, right when I had kind of like starting to wrap up this project, and realizing that I had this story in my head from a very young age that like, I need to live in a city, have a good job in a great apartment all by myself. That when that happened, that's I've arrived at, then I'm living life. And then this dread, right as I realized I had this, came over me, of being like, oh God, I have everything, but it's not, nothing has changed. And that might've been one of the major moments of introspection of, like realizing that looking, getting everything that I want from a circumstances, from an outside perspective, I have the house, the car, the whatever, didn't do it. And so maybe now I could start looking inward and seeing, well, is there something that's satisfying in my experience? And then you start to realize like, oh, there's a lot of things that are unsatisfying in my experience. That might be a place to start. It's hard to see our baggage when we're so externally focused, right?
Exactly. I would say we can't see it when we're only externally focused.
So yeah, it's but yeah, I definitely, I have a lot of friends and colleagues and things like that who I've seen make the choice every time that opportunity comes to then say, okay, I guess circumstances aren't what it's all about, to just come up with some new circumstances, because you can just kind of repeat this. I guess in Buddhism, it would be the samsaric cycle of playing the game of getting what I want and avoiding the bad. And if I win at this, then I'll get it. And every time you do, it just keeps, it's a vicious cycle. It's kind of self-perpetuating. So we have to look somewhere else for that satisfaction. And
I think that's the miracle, if we're using Christian language, because there's no reason why you or I or certain other people there's no some kind of sufficient reason that you can pluck from somewhere that says, oh, I turned inward.
Yeah.
Ooh. Or you can, you see what I mean? I call it a miracle, or an act of grace, or sometimes they call it an uncanny blessing. It's so strange to see that given, if you ran experiments, you had two people who are in basically similar, or let's just say the same, to keep the experiment very simple, the same situations, the same desires and so forth. Some reason, one person doubles down and modifies circumstances and moves to the Bay Area, and the other person doesn't and says, oh my goodness, this is just going to continue to repeat itself in variable forms.
Mm-hmm.
Either I'm going to fall into deep nihilism, which is what often happens,
mm-hmm.
or I'm going to at least turn back and investigate and pick this whole thing apart and see what this is all about.
Yeah.
Which also happens.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I don't, it really is, so to speak, an act of God.
Yeah.
When you look at those two, because a priori, you could not have told or foretold that this person would do this and that person would do that. I'll actually give you an example that's a little more concrete. A man went to a talk I gave in Florida in December, and this email just came in yesterday, so it's very fresh. It's very beautiful, and it's very courageous. And so he went to one of my talks, and then afterward he wrote to me a question, and he was more or less going to be setting up, I won't go through the idea too much, just don't give it away. He was going to go through a startup, and the startup would involve meditation in a workplace in some capacity or another. And he'd read a little bit of what I've written about total work. And so I was very gentle. I was just, okay, here's the broader thesis about total work. And the thing is that what total work often does is it takes something seemingly extraneous, like meditation, passes it through the mill of work, and then puts it in the service of productivity or efficiency and so on. Mm-hmm. So I pointed him to a book I hadn't read by Ron Purser called Mindfulness. He read the book. And over the course of 4 months, and I don't know what's going to happen. I might have just pissed him off, for all I know, even though it was kindly meant and it was done with compassion. But miraculously, I might say. About 4 months later, he writes to me yesterday and says, I pulled the plug on the startup, even though I had done all this work beforehand, and even though it looked good on paper. Mm-hmm. He pulled the plug on it. He talked to his friend. He read the book. Sorry, I'm reading a story. He read the book. He was resistant to reading it. But he the book washed over him. And it's amazing to me that even though it could have been a very good business idea and it could have been very feasible, he couldn't stomach it anymore. My words, not his.
Yeah. It's a messy thing. I've thought about doing, or been open to doing some consulting for companies and mindfulness as well. And as I was putting decks together to like sell them, I realized that I couldn't have a last slide that said, warning, if you aren't treating your people well, you will lose them, and you'll lose the best people that you have if we're introducing this paradigm. And I think there's been a couple studies recently that showed that sometimes mindfulness intervention led to a lot of increased turnover as well in losing people. So it's
because people started to introspect. Is that it?
Yeah, I guess that was the hypothesis, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I'm a bit torn on it, but I know that, I don't know. So maybe this is a salvaging a bit of, because I think what we're pointing at here too, right, is like in the same sense of, me talking about the story of the wedding photo. Mm-hmm. I didn't realize it was the awareness of the process of what was happening that led to that moment of grace, of being able to be released from the circumstances. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I guess when done well, we're inducing more awareness of the actions that people are taking, and that simple act of illuminating the previously unseen allows us to make different decisions. But there's ways, I'm sure I could sit down and orchestrate a very specific meditation mindfulness practice that would be all about efficiency gains and finding a way to keep people on task and everything like that too. So it's a powerful instrument, and I guess it just depends on the intention that's brought there, and then things are random too. So who knows? There'll always be some. Seems like the world's a messy place. There'll always be some collateral damage from any of our interventions, even if they're from the best, that come from the best place.
Yeah. Nice to have another conversation about ethics, because I think that's not as the problem of dirty hands, the tragic, the inextricably tragic nature of life, I think is not often talked about, at least a number of spiritual circles I'm involved in. It seems to be, if you have the right intention, if you've meditated enough, if it's coming from boundlessness or emptiness, then you're good. You're squeaky clean. And it ain't so. It ain't so. Yeah, it ain't that easy. But I want to come to the third category, which is the subtler aspects of experience. Tell me again. Well, let's just go with an example, since that seems to be the way we're moving. Can you think of an example that might help us shine a light on the baggage here?
Yeah. One of the fascinating things that I've seen, and I think I'll be able to come up with an example of this as I kind of outline it, is that so much of emotional processing requires or kind of centers around being able to decouple our kind of mental projection or idea or story about the emotional experience that we're having. And the interesting thing about our concepts is that they're very solid, and they have clear boundaries, and they seem very kind of enduring, kind of permanent, because they're static. But the fascinating thing is that if we actually kind of deconstruct what is creating these emotional experiences, the first thing is, I guess the most foundational, is an identification. So it's like, it's mine. And then the other part of it though too is like, there's the mental component, but the mental component seems to be, from my experience. And
so we say it's mine, just to be clear, it's my anger, it's my sadness.
Yes. I was going to go, yes, that's let's keep it simple.
Okay.
But the fascinating thing is if we kind of really start to tune into our emotional reactiveness, we realize that there's not really, at least I haven't discovered any emotional reaction that didn't include a physical component. And unfortunately though, because the idea of anger or resentment or whatever is solid, we see it as solid and separate, as a solid and separate thing. But if we start paying attention,
it feels like an entity.
Yes. And if we start paying attention to the sensations, and sometimes at the beginning when we do it, like we're not used to this. Like genuinely, it's like there's not a lot of stuff there. Like maybe I feel some contraction, I guess. Oh yeah, my brow's a little, little narrow, or there's some pressure or something. But the more we bring attention to the physical component of this emotional reaction, and really start to look closely at it, and it takes some time, and there actually has even been some neuroscience to prove that this is an actual capacity that gets built up, in the sense that the insula, which is this part of the brain that's directed toward feeling into our body, in meditators is significantly larger But the more we practice this, the more detail we get into our emotions, and we start to see that they have movement, or they're not static. They're evolving, they're contracting, they're expanding, and then we can start to look at the boundaries.
You mean at a certain time slice, emotion arises, we become more fine-grained in our practice or seeing. So we might call it sadness or anger or whatever, but we might not even need to call it that, depending on the kind of practice. But here it is in the chest, and it's red and fiery, and let's say it's pulsing in this way. Is that what you mean so far?
Yeah. And I think, and you can look at it, there's many different scales. Sometimes we can, sometimes just seeing the fact that that it's pulsing is a kind of liberating thing. Be like, oh, it's not just ever present, completely solid, like the idea of it is. And that can kind of have bring a sense of kind of like relief, in the sense of things are changing. But then if you monitor it a little bit longer, you can see that not only is it pulsing in the moment, but it's also, it comes and goes. And that's the thing about emotions. They feel like they are going to last forever, but they go away, or they change, or something like that. And the more that we can kind of start to decouple the idea of what the emotion is, and just get in touch with the subtle qualities of it, the movement, the fluidity, the lack of boundary. Another thing I like to do is kind of like see if you can find the barrier. Like, is there a solid barrier? Like, when does it stop being constricted and start being open? Usually
the start is to seem as if there's a barrier or boundary, but then as the investigation of the kind you're suggesting unfolds, it becomes clear that there is no such between inside and outside, or even in the body outside, in the physical body outside the physical body.
So this is it can bring some relief for sure, and then we can also start to see that there are components of it that are more and more about our ideas of the emotion rather than the actual thing. So like the classic example is, if you wake up in the morning and your body is just throbbing in pain and you're sore everywhere, and you're like, what is wrong with me? And you have this panic that arises because something's wrong. And then all of a sudden you remember, oh, I had a really hard workout yesterday. Like, oh man, I guess, oh, well, I really worked out. Like, I'm feeling it everywhere. That might have been a good workout. All of a sudden, this negative and positive valence we see is also separate from our emotions too. So the more we kind of see the way they're constructed, the fact that they're fluid and changing, the less we feel captured by them.
I'm a little bit puzzled by that example. You call it a class example, but I'm a little puzzled by it, because before we were talking about the experience of the feeling and the emotion, right? And we were decoupling from the idea, but that seems to be one story I'm telling myself that's been supplanted by another one, which albeit is more rational and comprehensive. And that's what seems to allow for the panics to subside. So am I missing something here?
Yeah, well, I guess there's, this is why I think, things like psychotherapy they have value, in the sense that we can actually use investigation. We can, in the same way we can deconstruct somebody's argument. We can point our intellect to the inner workings, the nuances of these feelings, to pull them apart and notice assumptions that we're bringing to the table, or something like that as well. And I guess the thing to point out here is just that, the more we investigate it, whether it's just through the physical sensation or through a very deep intellectual investigation, like in psychotherapy, we can pull these things apart. They're built. There's gaps. There's contradictions. There's they're evolving. They're not solid. They're not. So there's a lot of ways of doing this. But yeah, I guess the only reason I bring up the negative and positive valence, just because it shows us how much of the idea changes the experience, and how dire it might be. Another random example that comes up.
Yes.
My wife and I were on our roof, and we have our dog is up there, and
on the roof.
On the roof. Yeah. We have
Okay.
like a deck roof.
Okay. I'm imagining a highly slanted roof, and your dog's very Cary Grant-esque. He's like the cat burglar up there.
That would be more provocative.
Okay. Yeah.
But yeah, so we're kind of laying there. It's sunny. It's really nice.
Yeah.
And we start to hear this kind of like little whimpering, and my wife, she's like, oh, how cute. Listen to him. He's having little puppy dreams. And she's having this like very cozy experience.
Yeah.
And then I'm like, oh yeah. And I lean over and I kind of look and I'm like, oh, it's not him. I realize it's our pigeons that have moved underneath our deck. And I'm like, oh, actually that's not him. That's the pigeons. And all of a sudden it goes from this like very pleasant experience. You go, oh my God, the pigeon. You know, it's just
they're
like,
gonna shit all over the place.
They're gonna shit, yeah. Now it's become this gross, terrifying, gross thing.
Yeah.
So it's just like, yeah, it shows that how much our own projections and ideas, which are often imperfect, define these emotional qualities. And to come back to the subtle experience,
yes,
more detail and more information we have about our experience and the fine-grained elements, the easier it is to see these contradictions and feel less imprisoned by them, or kind of imposed on by them, because they're not.
How does that happen? How is it that these various investigations enable us to feel less imprisoned by our emotions? I mean, we know that it does happen. I'm sure you and I have the experience, but I'm just wondering how does it happen?
I guess the first thing that's coming to mind too here is like if anybody's ever had like a lucid dream of like being in this terrifying situation where you're being chased or something, or falling, and suddenly getting clarity into the fact that it's a dream. It goes from being life-threatening to being just an interesting dream. It just completely recontextualizes the experience for you to react in a way that's more true to what's happening. Right? You're no longer prisoned to assumptions of the negative or positive, or to kind of speak to this whole conversation of the way things should be or shouldn't be. And I don't know, it tends to have, it's a releasing, oh, it's a nightmare. Oh, it's,
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful example. And I think we can go a little farther with that. So if there's a lucid dream, and the seeming first person character is falling through space, and the seeming first person character whom I'm identifying myself with feels and thinks, oh God, I'm about to die, then it is indeed terrifying for the character. But when there's the awareness, it's just a dream, it also implies that the one who has just said or realized this is just a dream is not indeed the character falling.
Yep.
And what's happening there, from an Advaita point of view, is that I'm beginning to realize that my basic self is awareness with a capital A. And the more I do that, the more it becomes, I wouldn't say the more I do that, the more it is the case that I'm realizing my nature is awareness, the more events and emotions can be in flux, because I've ceased to contract myself into the angry one, or contract my into the one who thinks it's cute that my dog's sleeping, or that it's gross that the pigeons are crapping. That's what's amazing, is that I've basically come to a fundamentally different point of view. It's as if I've taken without being dissociated from anything that's happening, I've taken a radical step back. Even that's not quite metaphor. The background has, as it were, from the foreground has transmogrified. That's what I think what's happening with the emotions, right? First of all, they seem, as you nicely put it, like an entity. They're solid. They're seemingly unchangeable. They're like the self, the sense of a separate self.
Yeah.
And then it becomes clear through those beautiful investigations that there is, so to speak, someone undertaking the investigations. There's someone witnessing what's happening with the emotions. But the one who's witnessing is curious and open and fluid and so on. And if that happens often enough, then there's a shifting back. I like to call it kind of shifting back into fifth gear rather than continuing to go, or sorry, shifting back into reverse. We keep going forward into first, second, third, fourth, fifth. This is, oh wow, I can actually shift back into reverse. And from here, the emotions occur in the foreground. They arise in my being. They arise from the ground that I am. And I cease to be the one who's burrowed into the midst of them. It's a pretty marvelous. It's a pretty marvelous, but also, as you said, sometimes very mundane realization.
Yeah. There's I don't know, the phrase clarity. It's just like, suddenly something that seemed, it just the an instant, and the wonderment of it is like, if you were to try and remember what it felt like to think that they were real, like you can't even go there. It's like, it's an absurd idea. Like I can't entertain the idea that this anger is going to last forever, or that it's justified in some way, or that it's solid or separate, or whatever it is. These assumptions that you're uncovering, and it really does. It just kind of they vanish. Even though some of the appearances might say, I like the hologram kind of thing. It's like realizing all of a sudden that it was transparent, and I could actually step through that. I could push through that wall. It's like there's information to be gained here, but it's not solid. And I created the idea that it was. So yeah, and this kind of speaks to, I guess I have my critiques of psychotherapy sometimes is simply about the fact that they tend to deconstruct one troublesome thing by replace it with a new one, right? A new story that's a little
new
bit
sense
more
of
broad.
self.
New sense of self.
Functioning, if we're going to be a little uncharitable, that's a functioning self capable of living in a kind of late capitalist neoliberal order. That's the uncharitable. Frankfurt School, School of Critical Theory response that was already in the mid part of the 20th century is being made. It's understandable there. It's not always incorrect, and it is true that you can, if you're going to help someone cope better with the world that the world is, then you're creating a person, a self, who's more capable of coping.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And it's, and the radical thing here, I guess, implied in this, the deep waters of the spiritual practice, is to say that, like, oh, well, I guess I could just, pull the rug underneath out from under the whole thing. And then suddenly, the whole house of cards are all of these ideas and boundaries and limitations and things like that tend to just crumble all at once.
And that's why you got a gift, and that's why there are genuine teachers, and that's why there are sacred texts. When I say that's why, I'm being unclear here. What I mean is that the gift or the glimpse, I think, says something like, yeah, it's going to be scary coming to know self, but if you've had a taste, then you realize it's actually quite nice and joyful and peaceful or blissful or whatever.
Yeah.
It's extraordinarily hard to be someone who hasn't had any non-ordinary experience of no self, however transient it's been. That to me is just an amazing gift, because you don't want to just, as you said, pull a rug. That's not going to be a very good idea to think, okay, I'll pull the rug out from under me.
Yeah.
Because I see that these are various schemas or conceptual schemas or various constructions. If it's not the case that you've had some trust or faith or a teacher who looks pretty clear or whatever, something is providing you with that. So the three pillars of Zen, one of them is great faith. And I take that somewhat to mean that you have a postulate would suggest that this way of being, which we call enlightened, is the cat's pajamas.
Yeah. It's Yeah, it's an interesting thing, and I think teachers here are so valuable too, because kind of like I was saying, like when this while I might have pulled the rug out once,
Mm-hmm.
it's not something that only happens once, and maybe there are times. I'm sure that there's been some rare cases, but from most of the
Yeah.
people that I've interacted with, it's something that has to be done over and over again, and we the ego or the self tries to recoalesce in new tricky ways, and without somebody to kind of uh, be with you while you're doing that, it can be very easy to reconstruct very damaging narratives. Like you said, nihilism being one of the most obvious ones, is like, oh, when everything that you believed, because it was yours, vanishes, it's a very easy conclusion to make a news story that everything is false. And now there's nothing. Then we're in this despair.
Yes.
But the weird thing is that's just a new story. You've just replaced your previous sacred cows with a new sacred cow, and this sacred cow is here to torture you, unfortunately. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for this conversation today.
Thank you. This was fun.
It was a lot of fun. And is there anything you would like people to know about how they can reach you or get in contact with you or learn more about you? It's not that much of a sensitive question. It's just part of the genre, I think.
It is. Yeah. I mean, I guess if you're interested, jaredjanes.com, that has all my stuff, podcasts, interviews like this. And yeah, I'm also on Twitter at Jared Janes. My DMs are open and my email's on my account. And I'm always very much open to having conversations with people if any of this sparks interest. And yeah, my virtual door is always open. I love having dialogues with anyone and everyone. So yeah, I think that's the gist.
Well, thank you again. It was a really beautiful conversation.